In this video, we are continuing our funeral cultures around the world series and we're heading to Madagascar. You may have heard of their turning of the dead ritual, but I assure you there's a lot more to their funeral culture than just that. Before we begin, we post death and dying related videos every Friday, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's talk funeral culture in Madagascar. So let's put Madagascar on the map. Here it is, and if we zoom in a little bit, it's actually not as small as many people think. And although located about 400 kilometers from the African continent, Madagascar's population is primarily related not to African peoples, but rather those of Indonesia, more than 4,800 kilometers to the east. The Malagasy peoples, moreover, do not consider themselves to be African, but because of the continuing bond with France that resulted from former colonial rule, the island developed political, economic and cultural links with the French-speaking countries in Western Africa. And yet we still have no empirical evidence of how, why or by what route the first settlers came to the island, but they did. And yes, people from Madagascar are not called Malagascans, they're called Malagasy, and I didn't know that either. The country has almost 31 million people, with more than 9/10 of the population being Malagasy, which is divided up further into 20 ethnic groups. The largest and most dominant of the groups is the Merina people, who are scattered throughout the island. Some 2/5 of the population practice traditional religion, which is based upon ancestor worship. The dead are buried in tombs and are believed to reward or punish the living. There is also a belief in local spirits and a complex system of taboos that constrain traditional Malagasy life. Aside from that, almost half the population is Christian of some denomination. However, conversion to Christianity has not eliminated the observation of traditional religious rites, particularly those involving the dead. Other statistics that will be important for you to know in this video is that 80% of the population lives in rural areas, which is the reverse of most countries. And most lack many of the amenities that are available even to the urban poor, including access to electricity, running water and safe drinking water. Consequently, life expectancy is a lot lower than it is in most countries, with the average male life expectancy being 66 years old and 69 for females. Taboos. As we mentioned, the people of Madagascar have a complex system of taboos that rule over their life there, called Fady. These differ from village to village, even if both villages have the same ethnic group. Examples include, but aren't limited to, don't point at a grave, pregnant women should not eat eel or sit in doorways, you must never hunt a certain type of lemur because of folklore, sacred waterfalls must be protected, the killing or abandonment of twin babies, in certain sacred places or ancient ruins, it is forbidden to eat pork, goat or garlic meat lest you be struck down by supernatural illness. Whistling after dark may attract ghosts. In some villages, it is forbidden to plant bulbs. Children must not call their father by name or he shall perish. And shovels used to dig graves must have loose handles. The list goes on and on. What is applied in one village may not apply to another. People who break Fady are shunned as unclean and for endangering the community's spiritual balance. New Fady is constantly created, and when a new business or initiative is started, a ritual offering must be made to prove that it is not Fady. Funeral culture. Taboos have a big effect on how funerals are conducted in Madagascar, and because taboos differ between different communities, so do funerals. But what they all have in common is ancestor worship and wanting to have their ancestors happy with them so they may bestow good luck or, unfortunately, a curse. So here are some ways that could go. In the eastern part of the country, if a young person dies and it's not by natural causes, it is often presumed to be because of witchcraft. This means the curse that caused their death must be eliminated before the dead can be buried. But this can take some time. It is not uncommon for the deceased to not be buried for months, and the deceased will be shrouded and lay in their house during that time. It is common in many parts of Madagascar that when a person dies, their house is disassembled and the materials used to construct another house. The place where the house stood, however, becomes taboo, and performing bodily functions in it is a serious infraction and can cause family to have to sacrifice a zebu, a type of buffalo. Even treading on the area is frowned upon. The outline of the house is planted with octopus trees, so throughout the village there may be several rectangles of these tall, odd-looking trees indicating where a house once was. The Mahafali of southern Madagascar bury their dead inside square enclosures of wood or stone. The horns of sacrificed zebu and carved wooden memorial posts called alo alo decorate the tombs. The word alo means intermediary or messenger, so the memorial may help the deceased go on and join the community of ancestors. In Malagasy belief, it is only those who receive a proper funeral that become ancestors. A funeral is considered proper when each of the processes of tradition regarding funeral have been followed. However, even if a deceased receives a proper funeral, if they're angry with the living, they will still be able to cause sickness and death. This most often happens when the living don't remember the deceased as time goes on. So part of a proper funeral is the deceased being wrapped in a shroud. In the past, this was hand-woven, but nowadays it's more commonly bought. The importance of hand-woven textiles in Madagascar is in large part related to the connection made between cloth and ancestors. Cloth is considered an ancestral object kept and handed down within families and a potent symbol of authority, wealth, status, and identity. Because of this, widespread use of textiles in burial and reburial cemeteries continues throughout Madagascar. Wrapping the deceased or the coffin in cloth demonstrates respect for the dead, clothing them appropriately for their life in the afterworld. Remember that part for later. Once the deceased has been properly shrouded, the coffin bearing the deceased is taken to an open area outside the village for an afternoon of spirited ritual dancing accompanied by music and song. There may also be a speaker who recites various religious verses with great dramatics. Once the deceased has been buried, they now become an ancestor. As this is something to celebrate, they are not cried for anymore, as satisfaction and trust are what should now fill up the heart. Now when it comes to graves, it depends on the ethnic group. In western Madagascar, the Sakalava place their dead in rectangular enclosures of wood fencing, the corners of which are embellished with figural sculptures, typically bird figures complemented by the representation of men and women. Taken as a whole, the sculptural program evokes a balance, harmony, and symmetry of the physical and metaphysical worlds. The birds are believed to represent the interconnection of life and death, while the opposition of male and female human figures suggests fertility and the complementariness of the sexes. Humans are frequently depicted undressed, and in a region where rich textile traditions, this nakedness is striking. It is likely that these images of exposed genitalia reinforce concepts of reproduction and regeneration rather than related to the specific individual being commemorated. Another wooden sculpture called a volehete is placed at the burial sites of important clans. Measuring approximately 2 meters in height, these tall, narrow poles consist of stacked geometric shapes, such as circles and semicircles, as well as horizontal and diagonal lines. The Malafele people of southern Madagascar mark their tombs with sculptures known as alo alo. These are also a monumental size, carved with elaborate geometric designs such as crescents and open circles. These motifs are typically surmounted by figural carvings representing humans, birds, and zebu, the distinctively humped and crescent-horned cattle that are the centre of wealth and well-being for these people on the Malagasy plains. The Mahafali inter their dead in family tombs, large and solid box-like structures that are cut of natural stone that loom large over the semi-arid scrubland of southern Madagascar. Multiple alo alo posts sprout from the top of these forms, and the skull and spreading horns of zebu cattle sacrificed during funeral ceremonies are arranged beneath them. Merina burial sculptures of the Central Highlands bear no sculptural forms. Instead, geometric motifs are painted or incised on the stone walls of these houses for the dead. Ultimately, the most important artistic element of these tombs are the lavish lambada mene that swathe the remains of the deceased inside. These were gifts to the dead, used in ceremonies of reburial to comfort the souls of the deceased and protect them from the pollution of death and decomposition. So that is burial in various communities. However, for the majority of communities, the deceased being placed in their tomb is far from the end of funeral tradition. The turning of the bones. A recent death makes you grieve due to separation. On the other hand, during the turning of the bones, with your time of sorrow and worries often have faded away, the body has dried and doesn't smell anymore. So the event is to show the transformation of the dead into an ancestor, and this can happen roughly every 5 to 7 years. But what exactly is the event? Well, remember how we said earlier how cloth was of great importance? Well, cloth tends to disintegrate over time, especially when attached to a dead body. So it needs to be replaced because obviously leaving your ancestor in such bad shape would not make them happy. Thus, exhuming them from their graves and reshrouding them is seen as a great sign of respect. At the same time, their names are freshly rewritten on their graves as well. Refreshing the graves of ancestors is a way of keeping the loved one's memory alive and showing respect. Families whose deceased ancestors share a tomb will coordinate their wrapping day and hold a jointly planned event together. Those who were born long after their ancestors passed have a chance to meet them during this ceremony. It's a ritual that connects generations through its respect for those who came before. It also gives the dead a chance to become acquainted with their surroundings. A local explains, before the corpses are reinterred, they are hoisted up and carried around the tomb several times amid a lot of dancing, so they can become familiar with their resting place. It is believed that the dead will roam and terrorize the people afterwards if they are not familiar with their final abode. This is a day of great celebration with music, food, dancing and speeches, a sort of reunion for the families as it brings together people from far and wide. And as a side note, if you've watched this channel for a while, you may have noticed the similarities between this ritual and similar ones in parts of Indonesia that we've mentioned before. And this ritual may well have come from its connection with that region. The downside. Now, this ritual in and of itself is very interesting. It's nice to see people so comfortable with death. But there is a downside, being that a lot of death generally follows these rituals. Many Malagasy believe this to be because their ancestors are not happy, but the coroner would say otherwise. Madagascar is one of the few places left in the world where the plague, yes, that plague, still exists and thrives. Generally speaking, bodies don't pose all that much threat to the living. But those who died of the plague and were interred above ground in tombs in arid areas where they dry out and are then exhumed and passed around the community with many people holding them can still pass the disease on to the living, resulting in massive outbreaks. The government, on behalf of the coroner and the health department, are desperately trying to educate their citizens on this matter. But again, this is a very impoverished country with very limited education that rely on their beliefs to form their understanding of the world. But it does seem that a combination of government education and younger citizens changing attitudes, that there is a slow change in the reduction of these rituals, which should keep the living safer in the long run. Now, the elimination of a funeral ritual may seem sad. However, this one was relatively new to Madagascar, having only started in the 17th century. And as many younger citizens have said, we can respect our ancestors in other ways without risking our own lives. Madagascar is not a country we hear about often. In fact, most of the things that I knew about it come from David Attenborough documentaries. However, their culture, even though it's comparatively young, is fascinating, and I would encourage anyone who's interested in this kind of stuff to go look it up. We have a long list of places to get through in this series, but please let us know in the comments if you have any particular culture that you're dying to hear about as well. And with that, go talk death.